On a warm evening on July 31st, 2012, a disturbing call to the police rang out in a quiet suburb of Phoenix. Something terrible had happened at the Mellons' home. Officers who arrived on the scene found a shocking picture. In the living room lay Donald Mellon, bleeding, and his wife Rebecca sat next to him, as if disconnected from what was happening. What could have led to such a dramatic denouement? The family, seemingly ordinary, in fact hid many secrets. Neighbors and acquaintances spoke of loud parties and frequent scandals. Were these outbreaks of conflict just the tip of the iceberg? Some claimed that terrifying things were happening behind the doors of their home, but no one could have guessed how terrible the truth would turn out to be. The police launched an investigation, delving into the murky world of Rebecca and Donald. Something had clearly gone wrong in their relationship, but no one could imagine the depth of the tragedy until the horrific details of their life together began to surface. Former friends and neighbors told stories that looked more like scenes from a horror movie than reality. The secrets that shrouded this couple will begin to unfold before you, revealing that behind the facade of ordinary life lurks something truly horrifying. Who or what pushed Rebecca to this fateful step? And what happened in those final moments when things spiraled out of control? The Mellon story is just beginning, and the answers to these questions will make you shudder. That fateful evening, July 31st, 2012, the Maloney family had visitors, former neighbors with whom they had a good relationship. The neighbors were concerned that Rebecca was drinking so much, and before they left, Rebecca was upset. Then, she said, she and her husband had another argument. She claimed he threw her across the room, which scared her badly, and she grabbed a gun. This confrontation was not caught on CCTV cameras. However, police found a lot of violence on the CCTV footage, both by Donald and sometimes by Rebecca. They had a very tumultuous relationship, filled with both tenderness and passion, conflict and fierce fights. The abuse in the Mellon family had been going on for years. It marked a shocking twist in the case, as they discovered that police had been called to the house 21 times in the year before the tragedy. Cameras recorded numerous instances of Donald pushing Rebecca to the floor, punching her in the head, and sometimes choking her. On one occasion, he grabbed Rebecca's legs and threw her into the pool. Rebecca claimed self-defense after her arrest, drawing sympathy for being the battered wife of an abusive husband. But Donald's family insisted she also provoked him to abuse her. The ex-wife claimed Donald had installed the CCTV cameras for a reason. He was afraid Rebecca would kill him. The man knew she was going to hurt him. Also, the ex-wife said that he never used any violence against her. To understand what really happened that fateful evening, we will have to dive into the details of their lives. We'll explore the past, learn how their relationship developed, and examine every episode that led to the final tragedy. Let's break it all down in order and find out what really happened in the Maloney's home. Donald, surrounded by love from birth, had a joyful childhood. He belonged to a wealthy family that owned a McDonald's franchise in the western suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Donald was a wealthy man, and girls were drawn to him, but he himself dreamed of a family. That's why he rejected fleeting acquaintances and encounters. He grew up and became a nice young man, and finally achieved his dream. He met his first love, Karen Dawson. Their dating led to the truest picture of domestic paradise, where Donald Mellon became a typical loving father and decent family man, admired and adored by his 3 wonderful daughters. Donald, his wife Karen, and children lived a good and comfortable life. They spent years as a happy family, but eventually Donald began to abuse alcohol. Soon it became his only occupation. Donald refused to stop drinking even for the sake of his family, leaving Karen no choice but to divorce him. This loneliness changed him dramatically. It was as if the old Donald had ceased to exist. He now had strange tattoos on his body and could always be caught partying at clubs. He frequented a strip club on Bourbon Street. Since he was a regular there, the club manager introduced 23-year-old Rebecca to him, saying she'd come here straight off the bus from Nebraska. She moved to Arizona from Minnesota after an abusive marriage and was looking for a new life with her young son. Rebecca Cheever was born in Newport Beach, California, but spent most of her childhood in Omaha, Nebraska. She described her upbringing in a hyper-religious home. According to the girl, her mother tightly controlled what TV shows her 3 daughters watched. For example, the cartoon character Smurfs were considered sinful and were off-limits to them according to their mother. When Rebecca learned the Beatles song Yellow Submarine in school, her mother complained that her daughter was learning the devil's music. Recounting her transition into adolescence, Rebecca described a series of scenes in which men harassed her. Sometimes she was able to fight them off, but more often, she became their victim. Rebecca was not close to her parents, and as a teenager, she felt rejected by them. She was sent into the custody of a Nebraska child welfare agency, she said, flitting between foster homes. She said this feeling of loneliness haunted her throughout her life. When Rebecca would talk about wanting to leave Omaha, her ex-boyfriend would toss her across the room. There were always bruises on her body, and when she stammered about leaving him, he pointed a gun at her. But the girl couldn't live that kind of life with her abusive boyfriend anymore. It seemed to her that someday he would kill her. So one night, she slipped out of the house and ran away to Minnesota. An employee at the cheap motel where she was staying advised her to go to Arizona, saying it was beautiful there. Rebecca found the idea tempting. However, she postponed the move until better times. Rebecca got a job as a sales clerk at a mall. There she met a guy she soon became engaged to in Las Vegas. He was 19 and Rebecca was 18. It was a crazy love affair and she soon gave birth to a son with him. But later, their fairy tale came to an end. Rebecca was abused again. Her husband stopped working, and to support the family, Rebecca started dancing in nightclubs. She brought home good money, earning between $100 and $300 a night. Then fate led her to a strip club, where she found regular customers who were attracted not only by her body. Rebecca liked clients who didn't demand anything from her in return, except to be listened to. They complained to her about their lives, the girl encouraged them, and the clients paid her $200 and sometimes $500 just for a conversation. Rebecca earned good money and pulled the whole family. Her daughter was looked after by a nanny, and when Rebecca came home from work, it became hard for her to see her unemployed, drunken husband, who not only sat on her neck, but also insulted her in every possible way. At one point, she decided to leave her husband. The girl complained to one of her regular rich clients about him, and the man gave her $20,000 to escape from her spouse in Arizona. Rebecca took the baby and ran away. She gave her spouse's picture to the bouncers at the club where she worked, so they wouldn't let him in and blab where she'd gone. She moved to another apartment in East Phoenix and changed nightclubs. Some of her regulars moved in after her. There she met Donald Mellon, known at the club as a DJ. Despite the fact that at first Rebecca did not particularly like the man, later Donald was literally mesmerized by her. He fell in love with the girl so much that he was ready to accept her along with his 11-year-old son into his life. But Donald's daughters did not like Rebecca and believed that she was a negative influence on their father. Nevertheless, in October 2003, Rebecca moved in with Donald, and they were married 2 years later. All was well until 6 months later, when the first signs of trouble appeared. At the age of 36, Rebecca became addicted to alcohol thanks to her spouse. Together with Donald, she drank all day and night, skipping meals. Back then, there were only two things to be found in the Mellons' home: bottles of alcohol and an intimidating arsenal of weapons that Donald 46 collected. It was a deadly combination that soon led to utter chaos. On July 31, 2012, at around 10 p.m., police received a call from an intoxicated Rebecca. She was slurring her words and asked that they send an ambulance to her home because her husband was bleeding heavily. Police and ambulance rushed to the scene to save Donald but were shocked by what they saw. Rebecca was sitting calmly on the living room sofa with a cigarette in her hands, while Donald was bleeding on the floor beside her. While the medics tended to Donald, the police couldn't help but look at Rebecca with suspicion. Why was she so indifferent to her husband's condition? Then they saw the gun peeking out from under the pillows next to Rebecca and the bullet hole in the frame of her portrait from her wedding day hanging on the wall. After seeing all this, they took Rebecca to the station for questioning. When the investigators asked her what had happened, Rebecca claimed that she couldn't remember exactly what had happened with Donald. She claimed that she had just come out of her room when she noticed him bleeding on the floor, after which she immediately called emergency services. After answering a few more questions, she fell asleep right during the interview. Donald passed away at the hospital a few hours later, which meant that the police were now investigating the murder. Before detectives could begin their investigation, Donald's daughters discovered that he had left a voicemail message at 9:44 p.m. He asked them to call him back, and then they heard a loud pop right during the message. The confused daughters called the police but could not believe what investigators told them about Donald's death. They were overwhelmed with grief when they realized those were their father's last words. Following their first lead, the police began to examine the crime scene and were surprised to find that the house was being monitored by CCTV cameras. What they discovered next was most shocking. Donald's entire gruesome murder had been caught on CCTV. After her son had gone to spend the night at his friend's house, Rebecca was left alone with her husband. She then grabbed a gun and entered the living room. As Donald sent a voicemail message to his daughter, he was unaware of her presence, standing with his back to her until she fired her first shot. The bullet grazed his skull and hit him squarely in Rebecca's wedding portrait. He cried out from the sudden attack and collapsed in the living room next to the couch. Rebecca went back to her room and changed into a Shooter's World t-shirt. She then returned and shot him directly in the head. As the blood spilled onto the floor, Rebecca sat down on the couch next to her dying husband. She carelessly lit a cigarette and watched Donald bleed out for the next 23 minutes before calling emergency services. This crime scene was so disturbing that the footage has not been released to the public. The surveillance video proved that it was a clear case of cold-blooded murder. The question was no longer who did it, but why it happened. What was the motive? Rebecca's story kept changing. She now claimed that Donald planned to hire someone to kill her and disguise it as a botched robbery attempt. One day he threw a gun to Rebecca, and when she asked him why he did it, he said, "You never know when you might need it." So when Donald was on the phone on July 31st, Rebecca was afraid he was talking about putting his plan into action. Rebecca was out of her mind at that moment, grabbed a gun, walked into the living room and fired, but she couldn't remember the rest of it. As investigators dug deeper into their story, they learned more about the couple's sordid past. Family friends said that the parties with this odd couple were a blast. Donald was very charismatic, funny, one of the most amazing and generous people, and Rebecca was young, beautiful, sassy and fun. But Donald's ex-wife was of a different opinion. She thought Rebecca was a lecherous damsel and an alcoholic. Alcohol poured in rivers in their home, and it was not a healthy environment in which to raise children. She felt sorry for Rebecca's son, who was a teenager, and saw it all. Donald and Rebecca raced hand in hand down the path of self-destruction, stocking up not only on alcohol, but also on a terrifying arsenal of weapons. They drank all day and night, and it seemed like they never slept or ate. It was simply a recipe for disaster. According to family friends, what they didn't know was that Donald was jealous of little things and controlled Rebecca's life from the beginning of their relationship. He forced her to leave the strip club and restricted her to household chores. Even then, Donald criticized her every time and started insulting her. He forced Rebecca to get an intimate tattoo of his name to, as he said, mark her. In April 2006, Rebecca and Donald were leaving a bar, both drunk. The two were arguing and pushing each other, and then Donald began brutally beating his spouse and kicking her. A sheriff's deputy on duty in another county happened to witness the scene. He decided to follow them and called the police. The deputy told officers that he saw Rebecca quickly walk away from Donald. Then, according to a police officer, he saw Donald approach Rebecca and hit her on the head. The girl fell to the ground. Then Donald grabbed his wife and went to the waiting cab. At that point, they were apprehended by the police. Rebecca had a bloody nose, scratches on her lips, and bloodstains on her shirt. When the officer tried to take a picture of her wounds, she turned away and showed her middle finger. Despite the fact that a police officer saw the beating, Rebecca covered for her husband and claimed that he had done nothing to her, and that she had simply tripped and fallen. Rebecca told the police that they were wasting their time and that she would not leave him. Donald had a small scratch on his cheek and on his right eye. He told officers that he and his wife had a normal conversation. The man denied it was an argument. He said she turned to face him and tripped, causing her face to hit his face. Donald was arrested on assault charges, but was soon released as Rebecca denied the assault itself. In December 2006, police were called to the Milans' home after midnight. Someone at the home had called to report a domestic dispute. That person said that the couple had been arguing and that Donald had broken a pool table during the argument and knocked it over. The witness reported that the two often got into arguments that escalated into violence. Officers arriving at the home saw the couple arguing in a dressing room. Donald stood over Rebecca and yelled at her while she sat on the floor crying. Rebecca refused to answer why she was crying and even refused to give the police her name. The girl began yelling at police officers to get out of their home, eventually being arrested on suspicion of obstruction of justice. By March 2011, the Milanas had moved to West Phoenix. Police came to this house because someone had pushed the panic alarm button. Donald told police that his wife had hit her face on the headboard of the bed. He said he wasn't sure who pushed the panic button but suspected it was a dog. In the bedroom, officers spoke with Rebecca. After calling her name, she looked at one female officer and whispered two words, "Help me," Following protocol, the officer asked a series of questions to assess their relationship. How often and seriously does your partner bully or threaten you? Every day, she replied. How often does your partner demand that you do something, check that you have done it? At which point Rebecca laughed and said, every day. Have you ever informed your partner that you wanted to leave? How did your partner react? Yes, I told him I wanted a divorce. The reaction was negative. Police officers thought Rebecca was in trouble and arrested Donald on suspicion of domestic violence. But when Rebecca was told her husband had been arrested, she was upset. You have no idea what you guys have just done to me, she said. He's going to kill me. He's just going to kill me. Officers asked her if they could take her to a friend's house, a relative's house, or a shelter, but she refused. The officers left a pamphlet on the bed about domestic violence and left. In the summer of 2012, Rebecca shared with her counselor that her husband had become really paranoid and worried that she was setting him up. By then, the Melanees were living in a $400,000 home in the Villa neighborhood in downtown Phoenix. According to Rebecca, Donald changed the locks that only he had the keys to. He also installed surveillance cameras in the home to keep an eye on her, but an investigation later determined that the surveillance system was installed after the couple's home was burglarized. CCTV cameras were installed both inside and outside the house. In late July 2012, Rebecca was determined and tried to leave her husband. According to her, he broke her iPod and phone and locked her out of the house. She reported to a psychologist that she thought at the time that she was finished. After Rebecca's arrest, her attorney argued that she never intended to kill Donald. Why would a woman who had been continuously abused for years fire one shot that would just go over his head if she really intended to kill him? What would be the point of that? The lawyer stated. All of these statements left many with extremely conflicting emotions, but one fact remained undeniable. Whatever the reason, Rebecca fired the shot. In order to mitigate the sentence, Rebecca pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. At sentencing, she admitted that she had been drinking that terrible night, so she did not remember the crucial 23 minutes that could have been the difference between life and death for Donald Mellon as he lay bleeding to death, while she sat quietly smoking a cigarette. There was also evidence presented at the trial that could not be ignored. This video of the crime being committed was shown at the trial. The jury found Rebecca guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility in 20 years. She will be eligible for release in 2032. After the judge announced her sentence, Rebecca expressed her regret. I only wanted to see the best in him. I loved him. All I can say is that I'm incredibly sorry. As Rebecca began to be led out of the courtroom, she tried to approach her son and told him several times that she loved him. The woman kept her eyes on her son until the door closed behind her. Custody of Rebecca's son passed to his maternal grandmother. Rebecca remains incarcerated in Goodyear, Arizona.